Welcome, y'all, to an episode of Fandom Station. I'm your host, Matt, and it's my co-host, David Deeds.
Hello.
All right. Uh, I I noticed, or at least I've seen. It seems like I noticed that fantasy movies haven't been doing is great as like sci-fi movies. When I talk about fantasy movies, I know sci-fi movies are fantasy as well, because like it's in fiction. But I mean like medieval fantasy, magic, like knights, wizards, castles, dragons, that kind of thing. And I think we just haven't seen a lot or enough of these high budget fantasy movies like Lord of the Rings, like back in the day. So maybe a little bit, maybe it's essentially like The Hobbit as well. They're both in the same universe. I feel like I like more movies like Dungeons and Dragons, Honor Among Thieves, and that can go head to head with the sci-fi movies like Avatar, most of the Marvel movies, Star Wars, Star Trek. Those kind of movies. I feel like fantasy movies need more shine. And what do you think, Deeds?
I don't know. I don't think either side is above the other right now because a lot of the more popular shows are sci-fi, but a lot of the best movies or the more popular movies have been fantasy or sci-fi. So, sci-fi may have a leg up.
Okay, I think so too. I'd like to hear some of the movies you think, fantasy movies that you think are actually doing really well right now. Because I'm not the biggest movie buff, so I could just be missing out on some certified bangers. So I would like to see. I might end up looking up more fantasy movies. Cause I think a lot of them or there is a lot of good fantasy movies. I'm not saying there aren't. I just don't actively look for them, so they just go on my radar. So I might need to just look more for them. But I still want to have this discussion though. But before that, I'm going to get into news. All right, first thing, Kaiju number 8 season 2 reveals July 19th debut, and plus Side Story episodes July 5th TV debut. So Side Story is coming out before the season 2 comes out. So that's cool. Next, Tamagotchi Plaza Play previews basic gameplay new trailer. Nice. It's going to be on the Switch and Switch 2 in late June. And next, the quintessential concept smartphone puzzle game in service. You know me. I just really like announcing when smartphone games in service. it's becoming a habit now. Next, this new. Oh, I'm not sure. It's not new, but this manga, the new to me at least, called Hotel Inhumans, is nearing its ending, and the manga will end while the upcoming TV anime is airing. So it's going to add to the list of manga that end way before their anime finishes the story. It seems. And last, deadline: Kit Connor is in talks to star in Elden Ring film. So this could be the movie that changes the flow of things. So with that, I'm just thinking I'll just get the main topic. So we'll just be discussing, are fantasy movies like behind sci-fi movies, and if so, what could change that? And so what do you think, Eva Dates?
I think first we have to establish a point of pure fantasy rather than just fantasy, because if it's fantasy in general, then that fits with sci-fi as well. So, and in terms of pure fantasy, there just aren't a lot of pure fantasy movies being made anymore. Like you got, I can't really think. I think you got Rebel Moon. I think that would count as that's sci-fi. They just go into each other a lot, considering the aspect of sci-fi. But like the Middle Earth series, Lord of the Rings, all the Game of Thrones, a lot of pure fantasy stuff is very, very popular.
To that point, you mentioned, I know it's mostly about movies, but TV shows are also kind of including that as well. Something I will say? There are a lot of great fantasy shows out there they just aren't making movies as much as I would like. Because you have you have the Lord of the Rings series. I think it was the Rings of Power, and then you have also the new Game of Thrones series as well. Game of Thrones itself is also a TV show, and I think there's like a few on Netflix, like Shadow and Bone. There's one, probably a few others. If you count urban fantasy, not as well, not just like medieval fantasy. There's a whole bunch, in that genre, on the small screen. So yeah, I mean, yeah, but I don't know. It just does it feel like to you, Days, that there's like a barrier between the small screen and TV screen, or like these high budget films? And why aren't they like getting like these massive franchises like Star Wars and like the Marvel movies? Even though they include fantasy, but it's not pure fantasy. But I feel like more Marvel movies are more sci-fi than like fantasy. But besides Star Wars, I think there's also the Avatar series as well, which is like, even though it's only two releases in that franchise, Avatar with like the Na'vi and Pandora. Even though it's only two releases, they're still like the biggest movies out there, like literally the highest grossing movies ever. So do you think what do you think that barrier between like small screen and the silver screen is? And two, do you think why do you think we don't have like another big franchise continuing in this decade for like fantasy?
Game of Thrones was going strong until what? No, it was about 6 years ago, and it ended. And then they came back with another series, which is still fairly popular. So I don't think. I think that's all fantasy really needs. Sci-fi has a very diluted genre. It has a lot of shows and movies that don't really hit on anything. And if it does, then it's like very middling majority of the time until you get that one really good series. Like people like Pacific Rim, but I don't think it was the greatest. People don't just for some reason bring up Pacific Rim, but someone will bring up Harry Potter randomly. And I just think sci-fi is, while fantasy may not be making as many pure fantasy movies, it's still a higher genre. I said sci-fi has a leg up, but that's simply because there's more sci-fi movies and shows than just pure fantasy. But fantasy is still the more historically great genre over it. And as far as like the big screen difference, there's not really. It's just how well your series is made. Game of Thrones is more popular than some all-time movies. And there are some sci-fi shows that fit that bill as well, but I can't really think of them right now. I just think it would depend on how long your show runs and how well fans take to it to determine the level of success between small screen and big screen.
All right, I hear your point. Game of Thrones is still fairly popular, and there are a lot of really good fantasy shows. But the point about historic, the fantasy movie has like a more historic like stance or like ground to stand on. I don't quite agree with, because like think back to like the movies from like before even the 90s, like Star Wars and like Back to the Future. It's hard for, or even like I think Doom was also a movie back then. It's hard for me to think of any fantasy movies that were super popular, like affected our cultural like zeitgeist from back before the 90s. Like Lord of the Rings was in the 2000s, and which was still a long time ago, but it's not as old as those old sci-fi movies that everybody still thinks about, So what about that? What do you say about that?
I don't think Back to the Future has a leg to stand on. I think it is good. It is legendary in its own right, but it will never be compared to something like Lord of the Rings or even Star Wars, for that matter. It is a very good movie in its own right. On sequels, but it's not that good. As far as like Star Wars, yes, Star Wars is a legendary franchise, but Star Wars is also one of the few like sci-fi movies that have been just massive successes, that are like historic successes that will always be around in some form. Harry Potter hasn't had a movie in I don't know how long, and they're still getting games and talks about reboots. Lord of the Rings just got an anime like a couple years ago, and they haven't had a movie in years, decades either. There are very few franchises that can do that, and the more fantasy leaning franchises tend to have a wider fan base, or more people that want to bring that series back.
Okay. I'll just mention these few more old sci-fi movies like Terminator, Total Recall, and Blade Runner as well. So I'm looking back. I'm like, isn't it kind of weird? Okay, this is like it's like change our conversation, but like, isn't it weird that like even though fantasy is based on older stuff, it's like sci-fi movies or more represented in our movie like collection is like just overarching over the years since movies have been thing. And I just have a theory, just suddenly have a theory that maybe it's because at the time movies were first being invented, we were looking towards the future and not towards the past, and because of that, movies were mostly about sci-fi because that's just what we were interested in at the time, and this has like a residual effect on how we view movies now, where we don't think of fantasy for movies as much as we would have. Like fantasy seems like something that was reserved for either the smaller screen or like on plays and those kind of theaters instead of like in the like movie theaters. What do you feel? It's just a theory that I just came up with. What do you feel about that, Deeds?
I don't think so, because you have hell, if you want to be technical, the Disney movies are all classic pure fantasies that have been getting remade into live action series. Cinderella, Snow White, and you have How to Train Your Dragon that's getting a live action. You have stuff like Enchanted. Disney has really, held on to the fantasy genre. You also have Chronicles of Narnia that I forgot about. Like, there's a lot of pure fantasies that are just that are old, and they sit with people as well for a long time. It's just you just don't see it as much as far as like the stage plays. I think it's more of, I don't know. I don't know what the stage play aspect is. I don't know if they're more fantasy or historic based, but
Yeah, you have a point. I didn't think I usually put Disney in some like own little pocket because like Disney can make anything big if it really wants to, and Disney also has like a lot of sci-fi movies as well. Like not all Disney movies are fantasy movies. But yeah, you have a point. There are a lot of, most of Disney movies are usually just fantasy and they do really well, but it seems like live action wise, there's still fantasy is lagging about. But fantasy, if you go to animation, yeah, there is. And you count Disney, Pixar, yeah, I do have a point. So I still think sci-fi is really marching ahead of fantasy, but that makes me think like maybe it just like it's in its own lane. Fantasy is just it's doing something else that I'm just haven't noticed with like animation wise and Disney and other studios like that, like Pixar and DreamWorks with like How to Train Your Dragon. Maybe it's just more like live action leans more to sci-fi, and like animation does way better with like fantasy. But I'm not an expert. I'm not sure on all the details, but I think that's a good place to be in and think about it. And be cautiously hopeful about the new Elden Ring movie coming out. Yeah, and that's pretty much all I had to say. And I'll see you on the next one, travelers.
Audio.